The temptation is to run with scissors and apply the latest technologies, which are not as reliable, not as trustworthy.
So new comes up, AI. Yeah, everyone just automatically seems to drift in that direction.
You're still only getting up to 89% accuracy on some of the latest models.
What we should do is really focus on what AI can we use in those platforms that's coming, the new generative AI functionalities, and sort of focus on that as a sale to the organization if they are.
Today, we're joined by two experts who live at the intersection of AI, automation, and enterprise IT strategy. Jonathon Wright, a leading voice on intelligent automation and AI assurance, who helps organizations deploy emerging tech in a way that's ethical, effective, and sustainable. And Martin Hulbert, CTO of Ignite Technology, a firm that helps enterprises across Europe modernize operations through automation, especially using platforms like Broadcom Atomic. Together, we'll explore real-world examples where companies reached for AI, but should have reached for automation instead. We'll ask, why does this happen? How can IT leaders recognize when automation is a better path? And what frameworks can help organizations make smarter decisions about how to invest their time, talent, and technology budgets? Let's dive in. So the first question is, let's start out with the big picture. Where are you seeing AI being applied today in ways that might be better handled by automation tools? Can you give concrete examples, Jonathon?
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, a great question. And I think it's worth talking about the foundations of what automation is first. I've been doing automation for about 4 decades, and I've seen similar patterns and similar, I guess, pitfalls of deploying scalable automation solutions. And where you would normally think about AI potentially helping assist, I suppose, or augment automation, enterprise automation capabilities. We're now sometimes seeing, like you mentioned, leading with AI, and that's not always the right case. I think you're talking about, in essence, new emerging technologies that has a lot lower reliability levels than traditional automation. So if you think about enterprise grade AI, you're still only getting up to 89% accuracy on some of the latest models when you're talking about things like its ability to do OCR, image recognition. Whereas automation tools that have been going, like Atomic, I was part of the original Atomic team based out in Santa Clara when I was working at Computer Associates. And, the Atomic platform is incredibly reliable. The accuracy level is pretty much 97, 98% in comparison to, the latest and greatest models that we're seeing emerging even in the last couple of weeks, the frontier models. I think part of it is the balance, is augmenting and then also being able to understand that where the use cases are valid and where they're not valid. So let's just take a simple example, right? If we talk about the latest version of Atomic, which is 22.4, they use generative models for root cause analysis. So being able to understand, in essence, a huge amount of failure or pinpoint analysis or root cause analysis, and be able to generalize that information to help assist diagnosis. And so to me, that's a valid, narrow use case for large language models and generative AI. Now, if we were talking about traditional machine learning for a second, that's around analyzing a large amount of data and then, having a specific use case, a use case such as, okay, I'm going to use something like TensorFlow for, training against a particular component. So say, for instance, I'm having a reliability issue with a particular, screen or object or some kind of RPA challenge. You could apply machine learning and artificial intelligence, but it would take a huge amount of reference data. It would take a huge amount of training data. Now, you probably don't have those skills in-house, which is why, if you're someone like Ignite who can actually help support you through that automation journey, you want to leverage the core platform as much as you possibly can. The temptation is to run with scissors and apply the latest technologies, which are not as reliable, not as trustworthy, and run a number of different concerns. And I think the concerns with deploying this technology is quite complex, right? And I think we'll probably go into that in a little bit more detail later on. But especially frontier models like OpenAI,
Mhm.
partly you don't want to expose your environment to that because you've got a lot of sensitive information. If you think about your special source, the stuff that makes your organization great, you probably don't want to expose how you do business and how you build pipelines and do automation to external systems. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of, I guess, over enthusiasm around applying everything to using AI. And if everything looks like a nail, then everything's a hammer. Whereas actually, bomb-proof, enterprise grade automation has been going for 4 decades and is only getting better and better. And that's where Atomic really steps in.
Okay. Yeah, very well put. I think that I've been working in technology for a long time too. And you've seen it over and over with mobility around the year 2000, everything was going to be solved by mobility. It's the same thing with AI. It's time for people to step back and say, wait a second, this doesn't do everything, right? Let's look at some of the tools we have. So, but given having said that, we know there's a hype condition that's present. But why do you think AI is sometimes chosen over automation, even when automation would be a more reliable or efficient solution? Do you think it's hype, misunderstanding, or is it something else?
No, I don't think it is, and I think this is where I think there's two sides
Hmm.
of the area. There's what's available today, and then there's probably what's going to be available in maybe 5 to 10 years, right? And I think this is always the problem with the hype curve is that actually the realization of the technology is probably lagging behind that original hype. Now let's just look at the bigger picture for a second.
Hmm.
So, I was on a call with Sam quite recently, and Sam's been investing heavily in what they call large action models, which, I would call large automation models for a second, but the idea of being able to action a model to actually interact with the system. Now, you could probably straight away understand there's some challenges with that because most of the time it's never seen that application. So how could it possibly automate it? Now, of course, if I was in Seattle a couple of weeks back at the Microsoft Build event, and you're seeing technologies like Recall where they're trying to, in essence, capture as much of the actual system which you have internally, because remember, these aren't exposed but to these frontier models, so that they can use that as a reference of how your system works.
Hmm.
So if you've got your own specific Oracle, ERP, CRM, whatever it may be, custom implementation of a very complex system, whether that be in healthcare or automotive, maybe, financial services, it needs to learn that system. And so what really they're doing is they're navigating it blind. And this is where large action models, which were originally called a large agentic models,
Hmm.
were starting to be developed because what they want to be able to do is use the power of reasoning to try and make decisions. But that's trying to make a decision based on having no contextual understanding of the business and, in essence, aimlessly going through it. Now, it can automate it, but up to about 25 steps. So OS World is a standard benchmark which they use for doing this thing, and within that they've got probably about anywhere between 40 to 50,000 training sets of user interfaces which it can quite well step through to 25 steps, and then it will consistently fail, right? Which is, I
Yeah.
guess, a reliability thing. But part of it is in the future, and this is why I think it's worth thinking that what we've got today isn't what we're going to have tomorrow, which is, today we've got technology which is going blind. But
Hmm.
in the future, it will understand more about your application estate and actually be able to drive those screens much more efficiently. Now, I'm still not saying that this is going to be enterprise grade automation like Atomic. I don't think it is, but you will see the belief that it is actually automation because it will be driving screens and interfaces. Now, let's push that to a side because that's 5 years runway. That's a long way away,
Right.
and now everyone in the industry is talking about agentic. Now, I think agentic is worthwhile thinking about as as maybe not automation, but actually the interaction between systems. Now, this is actually what Atomic does already, right? They've got an incredibly powerful workflow engine, but they've also got an ecosystem which can integrate with lots of upstream and downstream systems. Now, what I will say is I would expect that Atomic will lead with agentic capabilities to other ecosystems. So if you've got something like ServiceNow and you want a ticket's been raised for an incident that someone's found, it would in the next few years seamlessly send a message to Atomic to say, could you help with this? Kick off a workflow, do these following activities, send me logs, whatever else you need. And these agents will communicate, AI agents will communicate together. Now, that's completely different. That's not automation. That is, in essence, helping doing AI productivity gains. If you've got someone like Ignite who comes in, has incredible good practices, which they put blueprints of what good looks like in your organization. And then instead of, them walking away and, you're not being able to do it anymore, they will set up some of those workflows as best they can to actually then allow these autonomous communication to go from end to end to help augment you on skills that maybe you don't have and you're having to bring in for a small period of time. So that's where I think everyone's got very excited about agentic AI because they realize that it's actually more about workforce replacement than it is about automation or anything else or AI making decisions. It's never going to make decisions. It's just going to follow simple workflows where you don't really want people to do because they're the administrators, the lower grade, lower, skills, digital grind, the stuff that's being done every day, maybe stuff that you don't want to have to keep on checking. And the communication might be that you don't go into the Atomic console anymore. You get an email or you get an interface to your Slack or some enterprise collaboration tool saying, oh, click here to go through to this message because we found this potential thing which needs investigation. Could you have a look at it? And then you get the right skilled person, and someone like some highly skilled resource from Ignite would be able to do a lot more because they'd be fed in with a lot more agentic inputs. So it sounds really exciting and it sounds like the future, and it's why everyone's getting so excited about it. But again, it's not automation. And again, the automation stuff they're promising is going to be probably 5 to 10 years away, and it will still never be at that level because it has no contextual understanding of how your systems work. And I think that's what's really important. AI only knows what it knows based on what it's been trained. And if you've got IP sensitive, special source that your organization does in a certain way, it's never going to know that information. So therefore, it's never going to be any use. And I think that's really important.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned Ignite Technology and the experts for Ignite Technology. Speaking of which, we have one here, the CTO, none other than the CTO. So Martin, based on your work with Ignite Technology and Broadcom Atomic, can you walk us through a real world case where automation clearly outperformed a proposed AI solution?
Yeah, I think unsurprisingly, Jonathan's touched on it already, really. It's around data. So there's a lot of work going on around data, getting data models together. And I think there's definitely some bleeding going on at the moment in terms of what could be managed where. So because the AI team are already busily working on putting those models together and getting all the data sorted out, they're kind of creating their own solutions, if you like, to move the data around, process the data. And actually, it doesn't need AI. There's no sort of intelligence required, if you like, in terms of adaptability or learning from the data that's being processed through. Really, they are just standard sort of repeatable tasks that can be easily put into an enterprise automation platform. So those are the types of typical scenarios we're finding where people are backtracking away from actually maybe that's not an AI based solution. We'll just use the enterprise platform that's already there and leverage the sort of pros that come with that. Because ultimately, the AI scripts, as Jonathan said, they're in their infancy at this stage. They don't have any of the functionality that come with the enterprise platform, so SLA management, remediation, any of the kind of sort of even notifications and things like that that get sent out. The robustness is just not there. There's a long legacy of reliability with the Atomic platform, for example, that's been around for a very long time now. So, so those are really where we're finding a quite a crossover in terms of where people are sort of trying to sort of use things that really, really don't need to be used. It's mainly around managing data.
Yeah. Okay. Now, data's vastly important. You got data all over the place in the company. You got to collect it. You got to organize it in a pipeline. So maybe this question is for the both of you, but I'll start with Jonathan. That we talk about how AI is being applied where automation can do the trick, but the other thing where these two technologies come into play is that AI requires data, and automation can be used to help you supply that data in a reliable way. Because if you garbage in, garbage out, as we used to say 40 years ago, but it's the same thing. You train it on something dumb and it's going to be dumb, or it's going to make mistakes. And the problem with AI and enterprise is that not only do you have to train it on common things, but you have to train it on things for that industry and for that company, right? So data is extremely important. So I'll ask Jonathan first, and maybe Martin, if you want to chime in on this too. So Jonathan, I know from your background, and you and I have spoken before, you speak a lot about, you run around the world and you speak about trustworthy AI and data readiness. Can you share an instance where automation was essential for preparing or validating data before AI could be useful?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a few things there. First of it is, and I love the term which you said about AI readiness, and it kind of leans into what Martin's just said about, this is a data engineering problem, right? This
Mhm.
isn't a data science. And we saw this 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people were investing in hiring data scientists, and really they wanted data engineers. And part of it was getting the data or the metadata into the right format. But they're also finding out that even when they had the data, even when we went through the whole wave of big data, should we call about it, we were
Mhm.
still very unsure about how that brought value. And so later, latest generation architects like data lake houses, right? Data lake house architecture is dependent on things like knowledge graphs. And, knowledge graphs, again, or any kind of knowledge retrieval requires it to be fed and mapped to, the correct nodes interacting and relationship between the nodes. Again, it's a data problem. And this is, a lot of organizations have managed their data very effectively over the many years and understand the schemas, they understand how everything should be implemented, and they're doing this manually. So they're doing the create, evaluate, analyze, apply, understand process of the data pipeline anyway. And what I think Martin's alluding to, which is correct, is they've seen the last 3 or 4 years is this. We'll build it ourselves. We'll create an innovation labs or an AI labs team, and we'll try and find a use case for using land graph and vector stores and knowledge graphs and retrieval augmented generation, because they believe that it would be a different valuable for their organization. And again, they're then turning back and saying, well, actually, even when we're getting the data into that format, into the contextual store that it needs to be, is actually we're not actually seeing that much value. And so, I mentioned RAG, retrieval augmented generation, and relative generative answering, but there's a score across that, a universal score called RAGA, and that in essence it gives us a score of how trustworthy that data is. And again, those numbers are low. You are lucky if you're ever going to see 90% accuracy, and enterprises can't deal with it at 90% accuracy. It's got to be as close to 100% as possible. And I think this is the thing: is if you're a small organization doing something that's not in a very regulated environment, and maybe it's retail, you're just doing an app for a fashion company or something, you can live with using those use cases. But if you're in a regulated environment, there's no way you can do it. And more importantly, you can't do it. So, the European Union AI Act, which has been around a number of years, so I'd be involved with the original trustworthy standard for AI, which came out building trustworthy systems probably about 4 or 5 years ago. The executive order in the United States, if you deal with the US, the 14110 came out and again did the same thing. And both those had a bit of a critical point. And that critical point, in essence, is November this year, which states there's an AI liability component. So if, for instance, you did go off and build a Skunkworks project to put some customer data in and do some action, if If you then relied on that in production, then you could potentially be fined if it found to be using an AI when really you shouldn't have been using that technology because it actually fails. It would do 1 in 10. Then you could be fined either 7% of your gross or 35 million euros. So these things are really quite key. So what we've seen as Martin's got experience with the quality standards, we've seen a new standard coming in called 42001, which is a risk framework for how you do AI compliance and governance. And it's incredibly strict because not only is it, expecting the auditing of what algorithms you're using if, you've been building on traditional ML and deep learning for the last 10 years, but actually it's if you're using this new technology, well, how has it come to that decision? How's that decision been made? And if you think about that in a pure automation sense, when you look at large customers, I remember sitting down, at Apple with people like Tim trying to deal with their huge data pipelines for every transaction on the App Store being an SAP transaction.
Mhm.
And actually, it takes 3 or 4 days to process that huge amount of 10,000 transactions per minute. It's a huge amount of data, and therefore the accuracy couldn't be, well, it's 90%, right? Because it's $1 trillion estate at risk if you then suggested the wrong application, and you just can't deal with that level of accuracy. So I think part of it is nobody is really no large enterprise, especially in the valley, are really turning to this technology to rely on it. They're still using enterprise grade automation for most of their data pipeline and automation problems. But also now the auditability bit puts a huge red flag risk that they don't, a bit like when we saw GDPR, but I don't think GDPR was as enforced as we were hoping it to be. And even the California data privacy is that we really want AI governance, and there's been a lot of deregulation in this space to try and encourage people to use it. But I think large organizations, we saw the JP Morgan make a statement the other day around their open letter saying, look, if you're building AI solutions and you're trying to deliver them into JP Morgan, we won't take them as part of the software, bill of material because, we're liable for that $1 trillion estate which we're managing, and therefore we want 99%. We don't want 89%. There's no risk appetite. And I think this is where we're starting to see a lot more, I'm going to call it grown up enterprise AI, where they're realizing that, like you said, actually automation or enterprise automation is going to be, and most likely will be for the next 25, 30 years, the only way you can do this, right? If you've got something you rely on for your organization, it's critical because it's such a revenue generating or risk exposure component. Um, or lives are dependent on it, you will never go to an AI based solution. You will still be using your enterprise automation platform.
Yeah. Yeah, I just will say one word and turn it over to Martin. But I mean, you talked about how JP Morgan, these big companies wouldn't take data. 90% reliable is nowhere near that. But you take the average user, if it, does makes a mistake, they throw it away too. Yeah, an enterprise user, they lose confidence in that tool. And you just, we all have examples of this in our own experience where it just isn't reliable enough. So you're not gonna close your eyes, right? Martin, you more than anybody I know, you're spend every day worrying about data pipelines and stuff like that. You want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think Jonathan's kind of got all the key points there really around, if I think about the way that a data pipeline is managed in an enterprise automation tool, we've already mentioned before that the automation platforms are typically plugged in very reliably into most systems in the organization already. So
Mhm.
that's a massive plus point. We're not building something from scratch in AI code. The sheer fact that shining a light on the standards that are being used to build AI solutions causing a problem tells us a lot about those solutions in general.
Mhm.
How robust were they in the first place? And I think if I look at the way the automation is used for data pipelines, audibility, maintaining accuracy of the data are huge things that it's been doing for a long time in an automation platform. We have organizations, banks, financial institutions, they're all using the platform so that they can have that auditability. And also the enterprise orchestration platform is designed to bring everything together at the right time. It's designed to take all the individual moving components across the organization for that data pipeline, manage the entire thing end to end, not just the data moving around, but anything that might impact the data. So processing in each individual system as it moves along, as each part comes in. That's a lot of complicated, robust technology that's been used in one platform for a long time. An AI script is not going to replace that. It's not got the full-fledged functionality that's coming with that. And ultimately, you know, it can also make sure that the data is paused in certain places. So if something's overrunning, something's not coming through on time, as does happen, it will make sure that everything arrives at the right time, so our data's there in the right format, and accurate. And it will give everyone the audit they need for when the auditors come knocking for compliance reasons and all the rest of it. So there's a huge difference, I think, in terms of the practical applications of the two.
Okay. So, I mean, I think we've all talked about the problems with reliability and things like that. And you have to have great data. I mean, it's got to be really good data and for that enterprise and for that job function. Now, having said that, maybe this is best for Jonathon at first, at least. What are some telltale signs or red flags that an IT leader might be using AI for something that deterministic automation could do better, faster, and cheaper?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two dimensions to this, right? I'm going to talk about the obvious one straight away is, the elephant in the room is you've already started seeing some of the layoffs directly associated with bringing in AI technology. So it's about 7% on average is what they're saying.
Hmm.
And of course, IT leaders are excited about that 7% reduction in headcount, right?
Mm.
And this is difficult because, we've seen, especially, Transformers 2017, we've seen this technology kind of become widespread in enterprises in 2021, 2022, especially from people like Microsoft. And therefore, they're starting to realize the benefits, and they hover anywhere between 15 to 25%. And that's kind of the benefit. And that's why we're starting to see these technologies. So a lot of it is use cases that are even potentially the IT leaders are measured on their ability to bring in productivity increases, right? And we've seen this year on year. We've seen the pendulum swing both ways in the saying, okay, let's offshore and then nearshore and then bring people back on because they need the subject matter experts who know what they're doing. We've seen this movement happen a number of times in IT, and so therefore, just because, and I've got a call later with Gartner today actually, and but Gartner and Forrester will publish the latest agentic or hype curves with these are the latest trends. There's obviously a certain amount of pressure on IT leaders to read those reports and say, okay, well, I need to bring tools in, new tools that potentially are going to help, improve savings, and therefore, they look at using them potentially for the wrong reasons. And I'm not saying that there's no value in them. There is value creation. I think there is from an AI productivity. If you say you're not going to be replaced by AI, but you're going to be replaced by other people using AI, then absolutely. And you can see that even within the Broadcom atomic landscape is using the generative AI for the right reasons: root cause analysis, pinpoint failure, summaries of large data sets, time
Mm.
series data, stuff that you would just not be able to go through manually. Of course, throw an AI at it, right? That makes sense. And that is, in essence, a narrow use case where it's accelerating the human in the loop to do more with less. And that to me is the correct use case for artificial intelligence. The words, the names, it's in the name, right? Artificial, it's just helping you, support you. Now, of course, those red flags, is better, cheaper, faster, right? And the problem is the triangle you can only pick two, right?
Mm.
Quality, speed, cost. Pick two, you choose. And, in the words of Gucci, quality is long remembered when cost is long forgotten, right? And I think this is something that's echoed, especially in IT operations management for a very long time, is that actually keeping the lights on and running the business, 60% of the business typically being, run the business, really quite critical that those systems are up and they're working. And like Martin said, the data arrives at the right time and it deals with resilience and failover. It's all that is built in. So the company can run the business, and I think we saw, I guess, unfortunately, 5 or 6 years ago, this idea that every company's an IT department, IT company, and not a business. And I'm
Mhm.
hoping we're going to see the switch back is that actually the silent, superheroes are actually supporting the business, but they're the less it's all about IT and it's more about business agility. They're enabling them to do business and they can sleep well at night because they know their systems are going to be up, they're going to be resilient, they're going to be at high quality, and their customers are going to get fantastic service. All the things we've been promising from things like Agile and DevOps and all these new approaches, these people and process, cultural processes that we've maybe not seen the full benefit of because we put pressure on maybe releasing faster. Okay, that's putting more pressure on release automation. Okay, we want to send more, get more releases, putting more pressure on the changing ecosystem. Yes, we've shifted to that and we've enabled that over the last 3 decades. Now it's part of making sure that you're protecting that estate, especially in those environments. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to start seeing a lot of failures. I think we've already started seeing people moving back from deploying AI-based systems to then going back to people-based.
Mhm.
So, I think it's a very short-term thinking, and I think that's a red flag. I know there's going to be a lot of the more layoffs, unfortunately, in these large big tech companies, trying to demonstrate that you can get these benefits, which is obviously improving stock price. So therefore, it's shareholder driven at a very C-suite kind of executive level. Is look at how good we are with this new AI technology. But not every company is an AI company in the same way. Not every company is an IT company. Let's talk about business agility and actually let's talk about operational excellence and let's make sure that if you're thinking about your brand, you don't want your brand damaged by saying you're a big bank, people can't make payment processes, the system went down. If anything, that's the most important thing in 2025 is the generation has got zero tolerance for failure.
Mhm.
But we're exposed to failure every day, but it's so important to protect that, and everyone's responsible for quality. Therefore, you need to use quality systems and enterprise grade automation and quality data to make sure that you can protect that estate and avoid the brand damage.
Many organizations are trying to use AI for tasks like scheduling, workflow routing, or basic decision logic. When is that overkill? And how does automation provide a clearer path, either of you? Jonathan, sorry.
Uh, so,
Oh, Martin, go ahead.
yeah, I suppose I can go for it.
Yeah.
I think really what we're seeing today is around, you know, we have products on the market that already do things very well in this space. So
Mhm.
scheduling, workflows, routing, basic decisions,
Yeah.
all of those things, they're all very good at doing those. The problem we've kind of got at the moment is that there is a sort of rush, if you like, to go with the latest shiny thing of AI. We have organizations that have AI teams that in place that are quite busy. You'd think because they're busy, they wouldn't push more work on them that would really need to go in their direction. But actually, if I look at the customer base we have at the moment, for example, we quite often find that Automic has been sat there for a long time doing its job very, very well, but they don't have in-house skills for Automic. You
Hmm.
know, Jonathan touched on this earlier with the generative AI piece that Broadcom are doing. The bit that really interests me the most is around the help around scripting in Automic.
Hmm.
So actually making it easier to use the product. So instead of having to have in-depth knowledge, you can simply go in and it will help you put together the pieces you need to make something work. And that I think is absolutely the right direction and a great use case for AI. So making a product that's very complicated a lot easier to use for anyone who can pick it up. And but because they don't have the skills readily available, and perhaps they have to engage with Ignite to come in and help them sort it out, it's very tempting just to say, well, those guys are really busy. They're a team already doing stuff. Let's just chuck it at them and see what happens there. And I think that seems to be sort of what's typically happening for anything new. So new comes up, AI. Everyone just automatically seems to drift in that direction. And we see that a lot from requests we get in for even the platforms that we have. Big question, do you have AI? It's
Mhm.
not even, I wouldn't mind the question if it were the fact there's no context to it. It's just, do you have AI? Is it AI anything? That's all I need to do to tick the box to say, yes, this product has AI built in. And that's actually something that we get into quite a lot with clients as well is what is it you're actually trying to do? What is it you think it is going to do for you? And then we sort of close the gap for them and then make them realize that it's a bit more of an actual tool rollout within a tool almost. So, it will do these things for you, and this is how it will help you in your organization. So you need to tell everyone else that when you roll it out, because otherwise everyone's going to go, what am I meant to use this for? And it's not going to work. Yeah, we see that a lot with co-pilots and things like that, for example. In the early days, everyone just turned them on and expected everyone to figure it out. But reality is there is a bit of training needed to go on to actually explain what's available. So I think, in all honesty, the overkill is when you don't have anything that really needs anything that can adapt or learn or change what it's doing or do anything clever. It's just a repeating task over and over again. You need to happen reliably in order, and you can layer AI over the top of that. Atomic has a lot of AI, which we've already discussed in machine learning, predictive analysis, understanding what's happening, root cause analysis on the jobs. Um, but it doesn't need any intelligence to the AI level in what's actually happening and in what is going on in that workflow. And that's when it really is overkill. And I think there's a lot of talk at the moment about the cost of AI. So even processing the AI elements, what is that actually costing in terms of electricity, in terms of the skills that are required to actually put it together in the first place, in terms of even water usage it's going down to now. We've seen a lot of things where the cost of someone saying thank you to the chatbot, wasted money basically going down the drain. So I think a bit like the cloud rush, where everyone thought cloud would be cheaper, and it turned out to be totally the opposite. And then FinOps appeared on the radar. I think a lot of it's sort of starting to be questioned now in terms of what's really applicable and what isn't. But we're still a long way from kind of that really settling down. So I think there is still a sort of AI first mentality, which then points everyone off in the wrong direction in the beginning. That's from my side, sort of what I'm seeing at the moment.
Yeah, just let me interject real quick. When I interview CIOs for articles, for example, sometimes you get this idea that we're doing it because everybody else is doing it. There's a lot of that going on. It looks like a good idea because all my peers are doing the same thing. Jonathan, you want to say anything on the topic?
No, I think Martin's done a great job at summarizing that. I
Mhm.
think even we saw the Build event in Seattle a couple of weeks back. We saw the Microsoft CEO saying SaaS is dead, right? And obviously there was a bit more to that statement, but it was kind of leading to the component that the models are changing and they're continuously changing, right? And I
Right.
think we're now seeing a push now to bring in a lot more on back on premise, a lot more which managing those estates more efficiently because the architectures sometimes aren't the most efficient, especially when you're deploying modern architectures that are typically quite noisy and complex. So I think that complexity I think is also having a certain amount of additional stress that's being put on IT operations and keeping the lights on and making sure these new systems work, which are already very incredibly complex and maybe AI infused, right? So, I think we have to consider that, and maybe that is the AI first problem solved. There is that actually, absolutely, if you want to build a new platform for your customers, then building AI infused software may be a valid use case. I don't think we've said the opposite end of it with AI productivity for your staff, but I think the bit in the middle around AI for AI's sake, just a tool having a bolt-on AI module so that it can be a ticking box for an RFP or some kind of tool selection maybe isn't exactly what's necessary. And I think that's maybe a bit of a red flag again for IT leaders for keeping up with the Joneses and not really thinking about, well, what am I looking for? I'm looking for enterprise grade auditability, traceability, enterprise scale, reliability. And I think it's one of the things I loved of working at Broadcom was, the platforms that they have been going on for 30, 40 years. And I came through Computer Associates and they predated the Microsofts and the Oracles of the world. And, they were building software again that was 60 years, things that like COBOL, which were just, are still used today. I think there's a reason why we choose enterprise over sometimes cost. Cost seems to be a very simple short-term decision, but that's where we've always seen a high turnover of IT leaders, and I think it's because of the choices they've made. So, that would be my only comments on that.
Okay. So maybe this one's back to Jonathan again. So now we talked about the different, use cases and the cases where automation would be better than AI. Now, if you were going to talk to an IT leader, which I'm sure you do often, and you give them a checklist, maybe how can they audit their current AI and automation deployments to identify opportunities to simplify by using automation and reduce complexity and/or risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's two sides again to this one. There's the future-facing side, which, we have to be kind of looking to the future, right? I have no problem with the idea that, in 5, 10 years, we will, have to embrace, maybe be out of our comfort zone a little bit of embracing a lot more AI. Maybe it won't be called AI by then; it'll be called something else. We saw this trend on hyper automation, right? It was the same thing which kind of came and disappeared, in a blink of an eye. And I think it's interesting to know because I think part of seeing large estates is, Microsoft, for instance, they launched something called AI Foundry, which was really a way of being able to audit what people are doing. I'd use the word process mining for a second, right? It's kind of where that sweeping statement around SaaS is dead is they were saying, actually it's all about intelligence that sticks across the top of it. And obviously they've gone down the agents route. But really there, again, this is workforce productivity. This is identifying people coming in, doing the same thing over and over again and saying, well, actually, that could be a route for automation. Now, in a way, that's that process you just mentioned, which is the auditing of what's currently being done. Now, I would expect if I was a betting person that 3 or 4 years, the decision will probably fall out of every one of those to put it into an enterprise automation pipeline. It won't be to apply AI to it. It'd be using AI to discover it and audit it, and then identify where the correct tool can be used. Now, in my very kind of forward-facing 10, 15 years, in a way, Atomic will be invisible because it will be part of every enterprise workflow that you have within your business. You just won't know about it, and that I don't think that's a bad thing. Martin kind of said, sometimes they don't have the skills to maybe do the scripting, and they obviously to make it better, they're adding in generative capabilities for code generation, so it helps lower the barrier of skilled resources. In a way, we don't kind of want that. We want it to identify a workflow, bring it into a visual format, which is what Atomic does so well, and say, look, we've detected this workflow. This is a candidate for automation. What do we need? What additional kind of auditing and governance and process do we need to wrap around it? And then are we happy with this? And then there'll be a number of people will, in essence, approve that process, and then it will go through. And that will be how it happens. It goes from a very chaotic, and we saw it maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago with DevOps, is we saw a lot of champions. We saw these single points of failure that were the superheroes who came flying in the middle of the night to solve the problems. And, you could not get rid of those people because if you did, then lost all the knowledge. To maybe 10 years from now, where a lot of that, so there's something called Microsoft Graph, which is already starting to do that. It's starting to understand the domain knowledge you're doing. It's reading emails, it's reading OneDrive, it's reading Confluence pages, it's running SharePoint. It's starting to understand what you do. Now, this sounds very scary, but it actually isn't scary because it's actually all about, I'm going to call it end game for a second, but it's the end game of getting it into an enterprise workflow force, and workflow system to actually allow you to take away that. Now, they may say, well, now what do we do when people aren't pushing Excel rounds? Well, we're freeing them up to be able to do the critical thinking and the business critical tasks that require human intelligence over automation. Now, I think that's the positive end game, right? The end game is supposed to be, it brings me back to the 90s when I started doing it. And actually, my the book that I wrote was with a lady called Dorothy Graham, who wrote the first automation script in 1972 for Bell Labs. And her task back then for Bell Labs was to automate a task, right? And we've been seeing that go on for 50 years now. So how do we get to that point now where we just continuously having enterprise grade automations being the foundation of our organization that is in the background doing the heavy lifting, and actually it's only coming out to bring in humans where required and allow them to free up. And I think that's where I think people are going to start looking at some of the initial investment with these AI innovation labs, like they did with innovation labs 5, 10 years before, and realizing that giving free coffee wasn't a great suggestion. And actually now we're turning into the fourth biggest coffee producer in the country, and maybe it sounded like a great idea, but we couldn't quantify what it was. And I think that's what's going to happen with AI, is they're going to realize they couldn't quantify the cost associated with that. And that cost isn't just, the cost that Martin mentioned, which is, energy and work, water usage. And, a lot of organizations are taking sustainability and sustainability development goals really seriously, and they should be, saying that actually we shouldn't just be spinning up huge amounts of unnecessary compute to solve a problem that actually an enterprise tool can use, automation tool can solve, which actually can do it much more efficiently at a lower cost. And I think this is what's going to happen is people are going to start evaluating them, and maybe even Ignite, right, will come in and evaluate your kind of your homebrew built system and compare it to an enterprise solution, and actually tell you that they can give you a 3x, 10x improvement just by going into an enterprise landscape. Whereas initially the thought process was, well, I just want to hire 5 AI gurus, which are extremely expensive because everybody's trying to hire 5 AI gurus. And that actually an enterprise solution can do a much better and much more reliable solution over the next 5, 10 years, instead of a very short term 8 months, 12 month skunk work project, which has a huge failure rate, right? Which, I know I've got 70 R&D engineers, and you don't want that kind of overhead. You don't want the overhead of a SecOps teams doing black duck scanning, doing vulnerability scanning to build an enterprise solution like Broadcom do. You want Broadcom, who I know because I was part of their engineering team, who have 5, 10,000 engineers who are all working on building stuff that is incredible. You can't. Why do you want to hire that amount of people to do the same thing that somebody else who's one of the biggest organizations on the planet is already doing? I think that's where you've got to the realization that it may look fantastic on your CV and sounds great when you start talking to people over coffee, but actually maybe it's for your career, it's maybe the right decision, right? Because actually you're gonna, in a few years time, it's probably going to be go back the other way. A lot of people are going to be like, okay, we've been burnt by this, we need help, come and help us. And by that time, you're going to need Ignite to come in and deal with all of the fallout of what you've done with the system you've tried to build.
Okay. Martin, the next question's for you. If you want to comment on this one before I ask you the question, feel free, or we'll just go directly to the question.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
Jonathan's covered that well.
Okay, great. So Martin, let's talk about resilience, one of your favorite subjects. How do automation tools like Broadcom Atomic ensure greater predictability, compliance, or repeatability better than some AI-based systems?
Yeah, and I think listening to Jonathan talk on the last question, actually, it sort of brought an interesting perspective to it all, really. It sort of reminded me almost of the days of when we used to have homegrown systems everywhere. And you'd have that thing where everyone thought it was a great idea to just create something new because they could. So they would go off and create something rather than taking something off the shelf and using it that was designed to do it. And I've probably made a career out of coming along and then replacing those systems, and it's been an absolute nightmare because, of course, they don't know any boundaries. They can do whatever they like within that. They're not following any particular pattern, standard, anything, So you come along afterwards, and then you have to sort of mend what they've done in terms of business process as well as technology to sort of fix it back into what the rest of the world understands because it's really bespoke. And it sort of feels like AI is in that same space right now, in terms of everyone's just creating their own things with no real guide as to what they're meant to be doing. Um, Compare that to a tool like Automic, as Jonathan was just saying there. I'm an avid DIYer and amateur mechanic,
Hmm.
and I can tell you now, one of my biggest rules that I've learned over the years is use the right tool for the job because you will save yourself so much time and trouble. And it's worth the cost of going and buying something, even if you use it once, just to use it and get the job done properly. And I think ultimately that's what this really boils down to. Automic is a platform that's been designed specifically to orchestrate, manage reliably, robustly, again and again and again, and with failover in consideration, all of those things. And, Jonathan's point around security, it's got massive levels of security in it as well to keep protected all of those things inside it. Again, it's plugged into lots of different systems, so security is key. And it's gone through the ringer over the years in terms of being tested on that, being pushed to the limit, and it's got a real big pedigree in lots and lots of large enterprise firms of reliably just sitting there every day, every night, doing its job. And that's what it's there to do. So ultimately, you're talking about ignoring a tool like that that's there, ready to go with all of that features and functions and pedigree and everything else behind it. And they're adding to the features every day as well. All the new functionality, even agentic AI. There's a new connector come out for that. They see a great future in automation, sort of orchestrating agentic AI in the future. Keeping
Mhm.
check on the AI, as it were.
Yeah.
They've got lots of investment in that space, way more than an in-house team is ever going to be able to put into it. So, and also, if you look at the cost, you've got the cost of obviously the product itself, you've got the cost of looking after it, you've got the cost of developing in it. But ultimately, again, once you've done it, most of these organizations, they've not touched it in 10, 15 years, some of them, because it's just been reliably sitting there doing its job every day.
Mhm.
Whereas, you can guarantee almost if you've got some kind of homegrown system or some kind of homegrown AI that you've put together, Jonathan's quoting really bad reliability rates there. So they're probably going to have to keep almost every day looking after it,
Mhm.
keeping it alive, making sure it's actually doing what it's meant to do. Whereas, you could just go and get this product off the shelf. You can get all the updates coming through, all the security patches that come through, all the new features, all the new AI functionality coming in over the top. And in some respects, you have to question why would I even not go down that route for something that sort of product is specifically designed for? It's almost like going for,
Mhm.
the supercar versus the truck when I need
Yeah.
to move my house.
Mhm.
It's almost that kind of argument. It's yes, that's nice and flashy, but actually the thing that was built for that job is probably the better option.
Yeah. That your answer, in your answer, you said something that really appeals to me. Use the right tool for the job around the house are mechanics. That's good advice for anybody, actually. I should take that.
Yeah, it's literally what I use for everything. It's
Yeah,
it's my career, technology, use the right tool.
right. Okay. So, Jonathan, this one's for you at first, at least. What frameworks, questions, or tools would you recommend to help CIOs and CTOs decide on the following? Do we need AI here, or can this be automated deterministically?
Sure. So I think there's kind of two bits, and I'll probably lead into some of Martin's great advice as well as we go
Mhm.
along. But I think first of all, I kind of mentioned it a little bit on a previous message around the software bill of materials, right?
Mhm.
So to me, this is one of the biggest, and in all fairness, it's the most exciting developments in recent years. I kind of, my next trip to India to see the global system integrators. And I was sat down when I saw them this time last year, and they would say, "Oh, well, we build our own IP frameworks that we would build to help our customers." But we're seeing a decline in that considerably because of this new software bill of materials. Now, this was originally came out in the US as a DoD modernization bill, but then it quickly went into healthcare, went into financial services. And then it also came across to Europe. And this was, in essence, saying, if you are releasing software into our environments, then you must follow these rules. And Martin kind of mentioned it is that they didn't have any boundaries before. They could maybe hyper customize something for a specific task, right? Not generalize it. And so, therefore, when delivering IPs, produced solutions which need to be maintained, they would need to be into environments. If you think of something like Log4j vulnerabilities, right? Most organizations built with Log4j because it was the cool thing to do. They need to know exactly what software solutions in their enterprise are built on this technology so they can quickly solve that vulnerability and stuff, and patch the gap. So, part of it is this is now all about enterprise scale. So, again, Marty kind of mentioned about, Broadcom. I remember, we used to be we're very proud of ourselves that we'd spend 30%, 40% of revenue on R&D. So, every year, whatever profit that was just put back into building new systems, but also, supporting the ones that we'd already got in there. But obviously, operationally, that was pretty much most of the business, right? And so you've got these 10,000 engineers making sure that, vulnerabilities that come are quickly isolated and removed, new things that come in, new standards that come in, they support as things are ever changing, whether that be, a new compliance or regulation within a particular industry vertical. They're really, really quite, supportive. And, equally, we used to use the words drink our own champagne. They'd use it in their own multi-billion pound organization, right, to automate their workflow. So there's a lot of experience, a lot of wealth of experience there. And I think out the back of that conversation, we had the fallout of maybe no one ever got fired from selecting IBM, right? It was that kind of original statement. And that was really the same statement we're talking about here is no one ever got fired for using Broadcom because Broadcom is a global organization. They did the biggest acquisition to VMware for 74 billion. They're a force to be reckoned in the industry, right? Maybe not as well known because, of course, they came from the hardware chip manufacturing, but especially globally in Silicon Valley, they're known as maybe in the top 5, 10, right? Um, but that does matter when you're talking to an IT or CIO to say actually there's as Martin said, we gravitate to buying German cars over other cars because they're well engineered and there's this perception maybe of quality, right? And I think
Mhm.
this is what we see now with these large, enterprise grade platforms is we know they're were built based on quality, like people buying SAP and Salesforce and Workday or whatever else they're buying, right? So I think part of it is there's an evaluation component, right? And that's really quite difficult because I've always found that when people, as soon as they start wanting to talk about ROI or cost, when it comes to enterprise, is this, well, this already assumption that it's going to be too expensive, right? And I
Mhm.
think cost isn't something that you should be factoring in at the start anyway. You should be looking at efficiency. You should be looking at evaluating it from a calculator which shows how your current process is in your to be state. I know this is something that probably Martin will be able to add in a little bit more about how they go through this evaluation process, but they'll do an assessment on, to help support you to be able to measure what's important. And those OKRs and those cascading KPIs that you measure internally, the sooner you can align them to what success is for you, the sooner you'll be able to quickly justify the use of these tools. So if you're finding you've got a goal, let's say it is operational efficiency, how can we help you measure that to show that you're actually going to get that value out of the tools within the periods of time that you're doing? So that would be the first thing I'd say. But I don't want to throw the risk card always in. But I think part of the software bill of materials is there for a reason. It's there because these homegrown systems and also even small companies that are trying to bring a product to market but maybe only have 50 to 100 people in their organization, they can't support you from an enterprise perspective. So there's certain things like customer support, third line support, all that kind of stuff which you kind of take for granted because if something goes wrong and it is 2 a.m., you can't rely on the DevOps champions, Batman, to come flying in and then put the light up in the middle of the night. You have to be able to get onto somebody who talks their language in the country that they're doing, who knows your systems, knows the technology, and is able to give you an expert response to solve your problems because it is critical. And every hour that you're spending with the system down or there's an issue in production can cost you tens of hundreds of millions. And again, you don't really justify that in any kind of initial calculation for feasibility. So there's so much to it. And I'd probably end on that last kind of comment as well around if everything looks like a hammer, a nail using a hammer, is actually there's lots of tools, and Broadcom have lots of breadth of capability in this space, right? And I think there's much to be said about having orchestration workflow seamlessly integrated into a unified platform with enterprise single sign-on, privilege rights, access management, all this other stuff is really quite important. And actually, that's when you start seeing more value. And I know it sounds cheesy, but one plus one always equals three, right?
Mhm.
If you've got two products working seamlessly together, you're going to get much more value. And therefore, Broadcom's going to start unlocking it with the rest of their enriched portfolio by using those tools and the power of those tools together. And I think that's something worth remembering when you're just looking at a point solution, which may turn up really nicely on a Forrester or a Gartner Wave, but always be cognizant of one thing, which is on the left-hand side of the Gartner area says the ability to execute versus their innovation levels. And what you typically see is they don't make it that far up because they don't have all that enterprise grade stuff at the top.
Mhm.
And then again, if you go onto the Forrester's viewpoint for the Forrester wave, you'll see the size of them is indicated, and there'll be a
Mhm.
little tiny dot, and that company might be the coolest talked about company. Let's say it's called CrowdStrike because, it's military grade, it's
Mhm.
cheaper than every other platform on the entire platform. It's never had any issues in production, and so every IT CIO just went out and ripped apart their old systems and loaded CrowdStrike on. And I don't know how that's going to end. Oh, actually, I do know how that ended. But it was because they were a tiny player in the top right-hand corner and they were selected. They didn't look at the McAfees and the other organizations, which were much bigger, maybe weren't innovating as fast as some of the smaller companies. So therefore, they're a little bit lower down. So you've got to take into consideration it's like all of the factors. And yeah, if you're a tiny small company, you don't mind your systems going down or
Mhm.
you can deal with that risk appetite of the unknown, then the unknown versus the known
Yeah.
is a decision you need to make and plot yourself on that graph when you're making that decision. So that would be my final call is look at more than just the architecture of the hype.
Mhm.
Look at the actual, the ability to execute and support your enterprise company.
Okay. So maybe Martin, let me give you first dibs on the following question. Um, Looking ahead, how do you see the relationship between automation and AI evolving? Should organizations look at these as opposing approaches or complementary layers?
Yeah, I think they're definitely going to be complementary
Mhm.
ultimately. I think they both have their own roles in this dance, if you like,
Mhm.
in the organization. I think as Jonathan's just been sort of talking about really the sort of top level compliance piece and all the rest of it there, if I think about, things that are happening at the moment around um sort of Dora, for example, which has come out relatively recently. Um, there's a lot of things there where you could talk about, say, a homegrown AI system or an AI system that's not quite so evolved because it's coming from an emerging organization that isn't able to keep up with things like this. You've got automation platforms from Broadcom, large established organization that's already ahead of those sort of things that are coming through. And I think those compliance sensitive jobs in an organization, in an enterprise, specifically, I think are going to be automated by enterprise automation platforms for a long time. They are needing to have that level of auditability, reliability, and as Jonathan's sort of rightly brought up, the back end support from the organization that's providing it. That typically comes from those larger organizations that have well-established procedures to deal with those sorts of things and the finances and resources to do it. Because obviously, those smaller companies are throwing most of their money essentially at developing those products.
Mhm.
So they're trying to push that forwards. Equally, if you've done something homegrown internally, your team looking at what they're building tomorrow, they're not thinking too much about all the stuff they've built before that now suddenly needs something changed.
Mhm.
Log4j is a great example. We went through a well-documented incident management procedure with Automic to actually get all of that fixed and out very quickly. So, can you do you afford to do that with AI at the moment if you were trying to do it internally or with a smaller organization that's just starting out? That was a brilliant question in terms of framing how the two are likely to sort of continue working alongside. I also think AI will have a really pivotal role in making automation easier.
Mhm.
As Jonathan said, the epiphany would be um, we've got a platform that we can just ask it to create a workflow for us, and start to finish, it just creates the workflow.
Right.
Everything inside it. That'd be brilliant if we could get to that stage. We're not quite there, but like with everything, that's on the future roadmap. That's where we're heading towards. And I think that would make the automation platforms really accessible to everyone then,
Mhm.
and really reduce the sort of cost of ownership. We talked about ROI, for example. We do go round ROI, but typically it's an upfront investment to get everything set up. And once it's set up, it just works every day and works for you and saves you money and time. So I think that the tooling will grow, AI will grow within the tooling, and then I think automation will definitely be there to support AI. So we're already seeing AI being used to help fuel the data lakes and things that are being used to fuel the large language models. And that's typically where we're seeing things heading in today. I think in the future, Broadcom's roadmap is very much around orchestration of the AI agents. So we talked about agentic AI. The
Mhm.
latest sort of functionality that's coming out of Atomic with the latest release is around actually who's managing those AI agents, who's actually keeping them all sort of tied together and make sure they are orchestrated correctly so they're not just running off doing their own thing. So I think automation's about to evolve again. So we've already had kind of the API evolution. So we've gone from agents that speak specifically to SAP or Oracle, EBS, or a database to APIs, which effectively let automation talk to anything, which has really opened the lid, cloud, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're on kind of actually orchestrating AI and making AI work for the orchestration platform. So, as Jonathan said, it's kind of replacing almost the roles of people. But now the orchestrator is going to sit over the top and actually make sure they behave properly together and actually do the job properly. So, the ServiceNow AI is actually doing its things in the right order for the AI over in the sort of resolution center, if you like, or wherever
Mhm.
it is that is then talking to. So I do think that that's where it's all heading. So the two are going to work more and more closely and harmoniously together as we sort of step through this journey where we are with AI at the moment.
Okay. I don't know, Jonathan, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's I think it's very complementary anyway. I think I think there's two aspects which I really liked about what Martin said is
Mhm.
like, the it's AI is growing up, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot more evaluation and observability that needs to be evolved to get
Mhm.
it to the same level. Observability is such an important area. And then there's a lot more governance and safety that needs to be put into there, as well as enterprise level integration. And to your comment earlier, it needs to be more deterministic. It needs
Mhm.
to be, it needs to be proven.
Yeah.
But I think the architectures and blueprints in the future will, complement each other. So I think
Mhm.
that's really useful. There's, I think there's some dangerous times ahead. I think you've seen a lot around things like vibe coding, and last year model context protocol, which was a bit building on what Martin just said around APIs for the AIs to in essence talk to each other.
Mhm.
And this is very in its infancy, but the CEO of Microsoft live on stage went in, picked up a bug that had come up and fixed it, and then released it into production
Mm.
live on stage. And that sounds fantastic, but it terrified me because I was thinking the CEO of Microsoft should not be doing production code. He doesn't know about secure coding practices. He's relying very much on vibe coding to do the heavy lifting. There was an analysis that 30% of production code now is written from Microsoft is written fully autonomously via these agents, and I think that can't be good for reliability in long term. I just think it's just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Mm.
And I think we're going to see a lot of fallout of that over the next few years. I think code quality's measurably been decreasing from up to 400%. So, there's a real concern around the quality of what's going out there in the real,
Mhm.
even more than what Agile was putting the pressure on building and releasing every 2 weeks, which was unrealistic. I think enterprise organizations need to embrace this in the future and look at where the place for it to be, but wrap around the same level of scrutiny they do with all of those other systems. So I think that would be my kind of final thing is that it's growing up. It's probably just not grown up as fast because it's not had all the heritage that we've
Mhm.
had in enterprise landscape for the last 20, 30 years. And it maybe hasn't got that IT core aspect that we're expecting yet. It's more adaptive IT. It's still very kind of fluid IT, very kind of short-term thinking, maybe not long-term thinking, but it's so hard for IT leaders to think long term because that also means being there for 5 to 10 years, which isn't the average life cycle or lifespan of an IT CIO CTO, right? So, with the exception of Martin, because he's over 5 years, 6 years of experience, in that role, right? So part of it is I think that's the thing is enterprise AI needs to grow up to the same level that enterprise IT is.
Okay. All right. So I have one more question, and let's start with Martin, and maybe then Jonathan can follow up. So here you go. This is a big one. What's one piece of advice you'd give to an IT leader trying to cut through the noise and make smarter tech decisions when pressured to use AI everywhere? Tough one.
Yeah, it is a tough one. And ultimately, I think it's really about prioritization of value. So, what is the value you can get out of using AI in particular use cases, for example? So, and that really comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where AI is not the answer to everything, and I think
Right.
that's now dawned on pretty much everyone.
Right.
Everyone's caught up. The hype has sort of died down a bit. But really, it's just what is the value we're going to get back out of this ultimately,
Hmm.
and does it weigh up? And I think if we look at it in terms of what we've been discussing on this session, ultimately a lot of what we've been saying is really actually there's sort of a negative value in using AI when an enterprise automation platform would be a better idea because we lose a lot of functionality instead of gaining it. So if we're not planning to use any kind of adaptability or learning or anything like that with what we're doing, then really we're actually better off using the enterprise platforms anyway. and maybe what we should do is really focus on what AI can we use in those platforms that's coming, the new generative AI functionalities, and sort of focus on that as a sell to the organization. If they are under pressure to use AI, that's still a valid sort of AI use case that could be used in terms of where they're using AI. So for me, it's really about that ultimately the value that's coming out of it.
Okay, Jonathan, you want me to repeat the question? Remember it?
No, no, that I think this time last week I was in Vegas, which is why it took me a lot longer to remember anything. But I had 2,000 of my sales team there, and I added this piece of advice, which was what you're seeing when you've got this pressure of, well, this tool does A, B, C, D, and
Mhm.
E. It's all AI this, AI that. The first is I kind of said to him, look, remove the word AI from the marketing material, right? And just try
Mhm.
and not read through past the AI buzzwords. Second is you'll notice quite quickly that they lead with very bold claims, maybe ones that are quite hard to justify, and maybe they don't have the testimonies to back that. So, I would ask them the hard questions. I'd want to speak to other customers that have had the success with the technology they're talking about
Mhm.
in the same industry, a similar size to yourself, right?
Yeah.
That's the simple thing because you need referenceable customers. Then secondly is look at the questions that are not on the list. So if they talk about they can do A, B, and C, but they don't mention anything about security and they don't mention anything about resilience, bring those questions back up. I love your tool, but
Mm.
how does it support resilience? And what you'll typically find is if it's not in the architecture website, it's because it's not there. And then you're measuring apples versus oranges, right? You
Mhm.
need to have a checklist when you do it. And I'm not trying to advocate to say go and look at Gartner, Forrester, IDC, Bloor, whoever the analysts are, but they will really help because they have the quite a fair selection of questions you should ask. So they'll say we look at these 8 axioms, you should also look at those 8 axioms. And that's a good place to start, right? And then the second piece of advice I'd give them is go and watch a few videos for both products. So, if you're looking at Atomic, you'll see you might have got already in the back of your head, oh, well, I used Atomic, 10 years ago, whatever it was.
Mhm.
Go and look at 22.4, right? Look how easy and easier it is to use and how the workflows are. Look at the kind of, watch a couple of content. And what you'll find quickly by, I'm going to say, doing your due diligence, but what you'll see is you'll see marketing videos with animations saying 40 times X, and then you'll see people honestly talking about the technology, saying how good it is, what it can do, with practical examples with real companies, and you'll quickly be able to get through the AI whitewashing that, this is going to add all this value without any real credibility in the space versus somebody who's incredibly credible. And then obviously the last piece of advice there is, go and speak to someone like Ignite, right? Who are experts and partners of Broadcom who know the tools, and they can again be honest and independent enough to say, well, you've currently got A, or you're considering B. What about this? The pros and cons, and maybe do a SWOT analysis and give you a bit of a framework for you to operate because they will help you with the business case of justifying that internally and building those stakeholders internally to get sign off. They've done this over and over again. So lean on the experts who know how to successfully deploy this platform into your organization and see you the success, but also are going to be around to actually support you through this whole journey. So that would be my final piece of advice.
Okay. Thank you both. And thank you everybody for listening in. Have a good day. Thank you both.